Welcome to Beat Diabetes, and today we'll be sharing a couple of more victory stories. One from a man who had a fasting glucose of over 200, but when he went back to the doctor a few months later, it turned out that doctor wasn't available. He saw another doctor, and that doctor argued with him, trying to convince him, no, you're not diabetic, you're not even close to being diabetic. A second testimony of victory involves a man who was finding it necessary to use Viagra all the time to enjoy intimacy with his wife. But when he got his glucose levels down, the need for Viagra totally disappeared. Now, this is from a Nigerian, and I'm always alert to my Nigerian brothers and sisters because my wife is Nigerian. So really, these are my in-laws. In Africa, if you marry into a lady, you marry into a family of Africans, the whole country is your in-laws. So all of Nigeria are my in-laws. And but this person says, Dennis, thank you. You're a lifesaver. I was diagnosed with diabetes 3 years now. My blood sugar was hitting 200 plus fasting. Well, that's quite high, 200 plus fasting. If I have a peak of 200, I'm shocked and say, what is going on? But I can't even hardly imagine a 200 number for your fasting when you wake up in the morning. He said, after that, I started researching and I saw your channel. I adjusted my diet and I dropped my drugs. Well, hopefully he did it with his working with his doctor. He says, to cut a long story short, I went back to the same hospital. A different doctor did my test. He said my blood sugar was normal. My A1C was normal. He told me, you're good. I told him I was diabetic. He said, who told you that? Love it. I said, well, one of your doctors here told me I was diabetic. He argued with me. So I had to explain what happened before and how that the previous doctor gave me the numbers and told me I was diabetic. I had the 200 fasting, and I changed my diet, and now I'm here. So he finally accepted it. Thanks, Dennis. My blood is now in the range of 80 to 90, and on a bad day, 100. I just eat meat, fish, apples, nuts, beans, okra, which is a form of okra soup. And African okra soup is a very low-carb soup made with vegetables cooked in with shrimp, goat meat, fish, palm oil, African spices. And then he says, what I called agidi, he says, you can ask your wife what agidi is. Well, I asked Benedicta, what's agidi? She kind of laughed. She said, you mean agidi? So I'm afraid I had my American accent going on there with the agidi. So it's actually agidi. And she told me it's actually kind of a gelatinous material made from corn flour, which is not ideal for a diabetic. And there's a couple things here that I wouldn't really necessarily feel too comfortable with in my diet, such as he eats apples, and then he eats beans, which I will eat a small bowl of beans. I don't eat much, and I don't even do that very often. And then this agidi made from corn flour. Well, corn flour is just about the worst thing you can eat. But the guy's getting great results. And so I'm hesitant to tell someone to change if they're getting fasting glucose in the 80s and 90s or on a bad day 100. I'm like, it's working for you, my friend. So God bless you. Now, maybe when you get older, you may need to cut back some more. But for right now, it's working. If you can wake up half the time with blood sugar in the 80s or lower 90s, you're doing something right for sure, especially if you've had diabetes and you've had high fasting glucose and now it's in the 80s and 90s. You've been doing something very, very right. And so anyway, he has found victory, and we praise God for Africans that are finding victory as well. And it's difficult for Africans for several reasons. One of those is they don't have the low-carb keto emphasis very strongly in Africa. They don't have nearly the food choices and different foods that we have. And then the African culture is just all about carbohydrates. Now, some of the Nigerian soups are actually pretty good, pretty low carb, but they'll always eat fufu with it. And one of the secrets to try to keep it down is eat a low carb version of it. One thing you can do is just cut it by half and use half your normal flour and then throw in half cabbage, ground up cabbage. And that cabbage will cut those carbs almost in half. Cabbage has very few carbs to it. But there's a lot of recipes on the internet, on YouTube, for low carb or keto fufu. So if you like fufu or ugali or posha, this doughy substance that Africans love to eat with their soup, you need to go on YouTube and type in low carb or keto fufu. Anyway, we rejoice in the fact that this man has found victory. So there is an African way to beat diabetes. There is an American way, an Australian way, a British way. They all involve cutting the carbs, no doubt about that. But we each have our own individual foods that we like, and we have our foods that we want to make substitutes for and work out. So like the average American is not going to get on YouTube and type out, I need a substitute for fufu. They won't do that, but an African will. All right, here's an individual. This man actually sent me an email. I won't share his name, but I do want to share some of the things he had to say. He said, I wanted to drop you a note on my diabetes story. I know you get thousands of emails, so I don't expect you to reply. He says, in 2018, I became pre-diabetic. My doctor didn't tell me. Strange. You'd think a doctor would be all over that. But he says, I was pre-diabetic. Doc said nothing. A year later, he said, my blood sugars are a little high. I should eat more salad and exercise more. I didn't have a clue how serious this was, so I didn't really change much. Well, of course, you wouldn't if he just says, well, you should. Should is not a very strong word. You should exercise a little more. You should eat a little less sugar. There's all kinds of you shoulds in life, but that's a whole lot weaker than you must. You have to. You really, really need to. So he wasn't even hardly emphasizing that you're on the border of diabetes. So this man is ignoring it. Of course, I would too. If I was in and didn't know any better, I would. So a year later, in January 2020, he says, well, your blood sugars are still going up. And this time he puts them on metformin and sends me to a class for diabetic education. So he finally says, hey, things are getting worse and worse. You need some changes. But even then, he didn't say I was diabetic. Of course, you could kind of figure it out if he's sending you to diabetic education. At the hospital, the nurse said I was diabetic. I took the classes. They told me to limit my carbs to 30 or 40 grams per meal plus 10 grams of carbs for snacks. So you can imagine 40 grams per meal, then a 10-gram carb snack, and then another 40, then another 10-gram snack, then another 40, another 10-gram snack. Way too many carbs to beat diabetes. It's just not going to happen. He says, that's when I happened on Dr. Hallberg's TED Talk. It changed my life. Praise God. That TED Talk has changed a lot of lives. And if you go on YouTube and type in Sarah Hallberg TED Talk, you'll find it. He says, I finally realized how serious diabetes is and that the Canadian medical system was not going to fix it for me. Sad. One day they will, but that day is not today, apparently. He says, I started to do my own research. Following Dr. Hallberg's advice, I quickly cut out grains, potatoes, and sugar. Good man. By Christmas, my A1C was below 6. It had been at 7.8. So 7.8, pretty serious diabetes. Now it's down to 6. You're back in the pre-diabetic range. Go in the right direction, which is everything. Going the right direction. He says, I'd lost 10 pounds. I was 6 feet, 215 pounds. My heartburn and irritable bowel syndrome had disappeared. I was keeping my blood sugar spikes to a minimum, using a meter a lot. And by the way, there is a term for that, which is what I do, and that is called eating to the meter. Eating to please Mike, you might say. And you're using your blood sugar meter to help you figure out what you can eat and what you should not eat. And if something bounces up to 150, 170, 200, 250 after a meal, about an hour afterwards, you don't want to eat that. You better modify it some way. Anyway, he's using his meter. He's getting his numbers down. He says, when I look back now, when my blood sugars first got to the pre-diabetic range, that was the time I started to take Viagra because I was starting to have trouble in that department. I was 59 at that point. That's really too young to need Viagra. But it was the case for him. He says in the next 2 or 3 years, I had to use it more and more until when my A1C was at its highest, I was totally relying on it. I thought it was just from getting older, but with research, I found out a big part of it was from being diabetic. Absolutely true. ED, erectile dysfunction, number one reason as far as I can see is diabetes and insulin resistance. He says, I totally wasn't ready to have that part of my life gone, so it gave me great motivation. Well, good for him. My A1C is now, get ready for a blessing, my A1C is now 5.1. I very seldom go over 125 after eating. Beautiful. That's pretty much my goal. I know I say a lot that 140 is my uppermost limit, and it is. But that's for special situations. Normally, I don't like to get into the 130s at all. And so 125 is fairly normal for me after eating. He says, get this, he was relying totally on Viagra for intimacy with his wife. Now he says, I no longer use Viagra. I don't even have any on hand. I just have to wonder if more men knew this, especially younger men, wouldn't that motivate them too? Well, there's really two motivations from this man's struggle with ED. The first is the fact that his diabetes was causing the inability to be intimate with his wife until he had to take Viagra all the time. So that's some motivation. And the second thing, which is extremely encouraging, is that once he got his glucose down and got his blood sugar at a more normal range, he didn't need the Viagra. He says, I don't even have any around anymore. Used to need it all the time. So, powerful, powerful story. And I haven't talked a lot about that, but it is true. And I've had the question asked me, will ED reverse itself? Well, clearly, the question was, will ED reverse itself if you go low carb and get your glucose down? Clearly, for this man, it did. My feeling is, in most cases, it will. And let me say, for most men, one of their great fears is, I'll come to a point where I'll no longer be able to be intimate with my wife without some extra help. And one of the most terrible things for a man is when his apparatus first fails him and he realizes he's not 25 anymore. The biggest and best guarantee you have to go through your life being able to be intimate with your wife and enjoying what God gave you as a gift to your marriage is to keep your glucose in the normal range. Keep those numbers down, because erectile dysfunction is all about blood flow. I mean, that is it. It is blood flow. And the one thing, one of the big problems of diabetes is you just don't have good blood flow. You don't have good circulation anywhere, including in the part of you that needs a little help to enjoy intimacy with your wife. So blood flow, blood flow, blood flow, circulation, circulation, circulation. And when your glucose numbers are down, your blood flows more watery, more freely. And ED can say goodbye, and you'll be done with that problem. So anyway, this is the best insurance you can have. And if you're having that problem, get those glucose numbers down and just see what happens. Don't expect, it to happen overnight. But in time, in many cases, it will reverse itself, and that is exactly what happened here.